Once in Ohio, he attends a wedding, meets with a number of dignitaries there, and begins planning his trip to DC. And he does that by reaching out first to the Willard Hotel, and the Willard's still there. In fact, I went to the State of the Union last year, and I made a point of going to the Willard and taking photographs there, and meeting the hotel's manager and telling him a little bit about the history of Dunn and the Willard Hotel. And the Willard writes back that he'll be able to come in and sign the register, but he won't be allowed to stay there. They realize that he is a man of some great note, and they want to have a signature in the register, but they won't offer him a room there. So instead, he has to find other options for rooming in DC. He gets to DC and he's welcomed on the Senate floor, and I believe he's the first Black dignitary to be welcomed on the Senate floor in that manner and allowed in the Senate coat room. And once again, he's met by the senators from Kentucky, and it's very funny. I mean, I have this love-hate sort of relationship with Kentucky. The senators from Kentucky tell him that they're not mad at him personally. They're more offended with the white men who brought him to the Senate and placed him on the floor to be honored. And he goes to he takes a photograph while he's there, and the very famous photograph of him sitting in Matthew Brady's studio is actually from, I
Here it
believe,
is, right here.
yeah, I believe that photograph was taken in 1869 while he was on the trip there, and he probably would have been brought there by somebody like Sumner, who was pretty familiar with Brady's work. He also goes to Massachusetts, where he visits with a number of noteworthies in Boston, and he makes his way to Lowell, which was at that point one of the textile hubs of the United States, one of the big industrial places in the United States. He visits plants while he's there. He makes his way up to Philadelphia, and from Philadelphia, he goes to New York. And he stays at the Metropolitan Hotel in New York. And once again, he's slighted when he checks in. He's told that he could pay for a first class room, but you're not allowed to occupy it. So even though he had paid for this first class room, the quarters that he is given are in the basement with the staff, and the Black staff lived in the basement of the hotel. So he's living in the basement of the hotel, although he's paid for a room upstairs. And he visits a number of schools while he's there. He visits Plymouth Church while he's there. Another huge slight against Dunn is made when a number of people on Wall Street decide to play a prank and get it in the newspaper. And they do this by finding a barber. And you could do this before the age of television. No one had seen Dunn. Most New Yorkers wouldn't have known what Dunn looked like. But they bring this group of stock brokers brings a Black man who's a barber to Wall Street and to the exchange, and they present him falsely as Dunn. And this man, obviously, and they're going to find out via conversation with him that this man is not Dunn, but he sort of makes a laughing stock of Dunn, and he makes a laughing stock of Louisiana by having this ruse done and having this mistaken identity. He asked the governor who had lived in New Orleans, Governor Allen Oakley, if he could come by and have lunch with him. And the governor will write back that if he ever writes him again, that he'll have him thrown out of the hotel. Now, this reception, this long train of assaults that takes place on Dunn's character and person, um, tell us a great deal about notions of equality in the North, because this is the so-called land of the free. I want to go up north and see what it's like in the North, and whether people are exercising their freedoms in the North. And what Dunn discovers is no. I mean, there are all sorts of inequalities that exist uh, in the North as well as in the South. But this is an important sort of stance that he takes on public transit and this idea of travel and where blacks can go and what sort of accommodations will be open to them. Now, you also have to remember that this is at the same time, this 14th Amendment that is right there, and and this is, blacks already have the right to vote. Blacks supposedly under the 14th Amendment have equality, and he's being barred from all sorts of places that he travels to. So it tells us a lot about Dunn. It tells us a lot about the period, and it tells us a lot about sort of the hypocrisy that existed.
Do we have another question? Raise a hand or put your question in the chat. Let's see. So we have a question here. If the second grade school teacher is still living, have you had any communication with her relative to your book? So this is the situation where you were told Dunn was not the first, that there had not been any black lieutenant governors or governors in Louisiana.
To tell you honestly, I do not even remember her name. I was there for only a portion of the year while my mother was in school in Illinois. So as soon as my mother completed her studies, I was no longer in that school. I was moved to another school. So, but I would imagine she was an older lady. I wouldn't imagine that she would still be alive.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Let's see. Looking for questions here. Let's see. I'm trying to think of some things that we had to skip over yesterday. And one that may be interesting to folks, Brian, is Dunn's time as acting governor in 1871. There were two periods where he stepped in as acting governor, and maybe you can talk a little bit about what happened that precipitated him needing to step up, and then what he did while he was acting governor.
The first period happens in 1870 when Warmoth injures his foot. And with this injury, Warmoth's foot is nearly has to be amputated.
Mhm.
And Warmoth does not want anyone to know how injured he is. So initially, he continues to go to work, or at least appear to go to work, and have his secretary, a man by the name of Brogdon, go in and do the necessary work for him and bring papers back. At some point, however, it becomes impossible for him to work at the office, and he decides to recuperate along the Gulf shores. Um, and he has a camp there, a house there, and he leaves the city secretly because he doesn't want Dunn to know that he's gone. And all of this administrative work that the governor was doing immediately falls on Dunn. Um, at the time, there had been a Malaysian or a Philippine sailor that had been killed by two European nationals. And he had been brought to court and sentenced to death, these two gentlemen. And consuls from Europe had been asking Dunn to go ahead and send their sentences over to Europe and allow these men to go to Europe and be punished there. And this put Dunn in a very precarious place. Now, had he decided, okay, I'm going to forego what the justice system has done here and ruling against these white men and allow them to leave the United States. I'm sure he believed that they would not be punished at all in Europe for killing someone who is seen as beneath them. So he cleverly gets himself out of that situation by maintaining, look, had I been a white person, I could make a decision pretty free of uh, the responsibilities and free of being punished for this decision. But I can't do that as a black man. I have to follow the letter of the law and they're going to be executed. So he takes on that burden. He also he pardons a police officer that had accepted a gift from someone who lived along the beat that he worked. And this police officer was convicted and sent to prison, and the judge wanted him released. His attorney wanted him released, and the prosecutor wanted him released. But because of the letter of the law, he had to be sentenced to a minimum sentence. And Dunn pardons this police officer. A sort of sidebar to this is when Wormuth does come back to the city and realize that Dunn has done this, he has the man rearrested, despite the fact that everyone involved in the case wanted him released. He has him rearrested and resentenced to jail. He also begins filling vacant posts. He realized that political power meant having people in key positions. So any key positions that were open after Wormuth left, he began filling with people who were in support of his faction. When Wormuth hears about this, and the way Wormuth hears about this is there is an assessor, I believe, who needed vacation time. He needed some time off, and he put in for leave. And Dunn maintained I can't give him leave unless I have some official papers or stamps that were in the governor's office. And he goes to the governor's office. It's locked. Brogdon's there, and Brogdon says, "Well, no, you can't come to the governor's office." Well, when Brogdon leaves, he has a locksmith come and pick the locks to the governor's office. And he maintains that, look, I'm acting under the Constitution, which says that I have to fill the vacancy of the governor if he's incapacitated. And he governs in that manner until Wormuth finds out what he's doing.
Mhm.
And Wormuth comes on the next smoking train back to the city on crutches, gets back to his
Yeah.
office, and then begins to admonish Dunn for doing his duty under the Constitution.
Yeah, literally on crutches. Some of the newspaper stories of this account, I mean, you can't make this stuff up. We have a bunch of questions in the chat, but I've seen Susan Guidry has her hand up, so perhaps she can either write in the chat or unmute yourself, Susan, and you can ask your question, and then we'll jump over and try to get to some of these. They're starting to pile up.
Hi, I was just wanting to follow up on Dunn's trip up to the north and east. I mean, what were his motivations? Were they political, and to what extent did any of his goals get fulfilled as a result of that trip? Thank you.
He never clearly states or articulates his goals in any of the newspapers that I have found regarding the trip. However, a number of newspapers do speculate at what his goals were. And most of them maintain that he's there to ensure that when appointments are made in Louisiana by Grant, that these appointments are people in his camp and people that he approves of. So as Grant is making these appointments, Dunn wants to be there and direct him to appoint people that are going to be favorable to his position. One of the people that he quite openly, and in fact, there is some discussion of this in the Grant letter books, but one of the people he's very, very forceful about getting back to Louisiana is Philip Sheridan. And if you recall, Philip Sheridan had been the first person to appoint him. and Francis Dumas to office. So he begs Grant, why don't you send back Philip Sheridan? He was a great administrator, and he doesn't do this, but it's interesting that he takes that position.
There's a couple of quick questions here I think I can tick off, and then we got some fun ones for you, Brian. So someone asked, how long did it take this project from concept to published novel take? Brian, I think we brought you under contract in 2017, so about 4 years ago. But I mean, he had been working on his dissertation, took years, and it had published in 2011. And Brian's research dates back decades. But from the time we took essentially his manuscript to the book that launched yesterday or this weekend, about 4 years. Another question was, oh, I lost it. Well, somebody wants to know, Brian, what's your favorite image in the book?
My favorite image, I love the new photograph that was purchased by the National African American Museum. That was one that I had not known of. Actually, I was bidding on it. The collection was bidding on everybody in America was bidding on that photograph. None of us, all beknownst to the others. So we were all bidding against each other. Ultimately, the National Museum actually acquired it, and it's the first time that I've seen that image. I mean, immediately when I saw it, I wanted it. And it didn't. My budget was, I think, $2,500, and it very quickly elapsed the $2,500 budget I had put aside for the photograph.
Are there any illustrations? So that one we didn't get in the book.
My favorite
obviously.
illustration.
Yeah.
I love the night scenes, and when I can't say it's a single one, but I find them to be enchanting, sort of. They invoke a New Orleans that seems very happy, very lively, and I think it tells of the New Orleans that I grew up in, or the New Orleans that I love.
We had a question about how we chose the cover image here, and I can quickly say that we wanted to demonstrate kind of at a glance that this was a person of import, a Black leader of import, that he's taking an oath of office here. You can see the book here. And so, there's a lot that goes into how you determine a cover, especially when you have an illustrator who can create whatever you come up with. It's not like with a photograph, you have a choice of what's there. Here, you actually make the image you want to see. So we chose Dunn taking the oath of office to convey his importance in history, to intrigue, to bring people in, and also, to kind of mesh with the title Monumental. It's a very statuesque pose. So that's kind of the thinking behind that. Somebody wants to know, Brian, I think this question came in yesterday and we missed it, about Dunn's work negotiating contracts for freedmen, and specifically, did he do this for individuals, or were plantation workers organized? Were these workers employed by River Parish cane plantations? So maybe you can talk a little about his work in his intelligence office.
This is actually twofold, in that he is recruited by plantation owners to find laborers for the plantations. And then he's also working with the Reconstruction government to make sure that they're treated fairly. And he's working on a whole nother level with the actual workers themselves. So in an article that I found, it maintained that Dunn was so popular that not only in Louisiana, throughout Louisiana, was he known for contracting, but also in the neighboring state of Mississippi, he had done contracts. And that his contracts usually were so well done that both participants, the planter and the freedmen, were both content with the outcome. So it was much sought after in regard to his skills at negotiating such contracts. I believe that this might have been the hesitation that he has to run for political office. If you had been very, very successful in negotiating these contracts, and you had this time and leisure to go out and travel and do these contracts. Being in the governor's office ends that stream of revenue that you had been producing. Being the lieutenant governor meant that, you know, he was tied to the city of New Orleans and wouldn't be moving about and wouldn't be working in these various communities that he had been working in.
And another note from your research that I was fascinated by was you talked about his reputation, and this was written about in the New Orleans Tribune, where they lauded, you know, his advocacy for freedmen. And so they talk about the federal mandated minimum wages for laborers. And so for first class men, it was $10 a month. For first class women, and so they had classes based on skill, was $8 a month. And Dunn typically, according to the Tribune, negotiated much higher than minimum wage for laborers. Men could get $15 a month, women could get $10 under his services. So, you know, he got people better pay than what was mandated by the government. We have so many questions. I want to get to as many as we can here. Let's see. Is there active dialogue to begin teaching about Dunn in the schools of Louisiana? I can say that we're working on it. We definitely are in communication with teachers, and you know, we have a whole education department here at the Historic New Orleans Collection that is working on ways to get this book into the hands of teachers and students. And you can go to hnoc.org/donate books to donate funds to help us get copies into classrooms. There's also been some discussion about working Monumental into state curriculum. Those conversations are ongoing, but we're definitely working on it. And I don't know, Brian, if you've heard anything else about anybody. I know that you've been getting a lot of calls from educators about this.
Yes, I've been getting a lot of calls from educators, and I've been paying a lot of visits to classrooms lately. So classrooms that are planning on using it, with groups of teachers who are planning on using it in their classrooms. I've been doing workshops, and I'm always willing to do workshops. So if there are any teachers out there, if there are any teachers who would like me to visit their class that plan on using the book, please feel free to shoot me an email, and I would be happy to set up a time that I can visit your classroom and actually lecture.
A question here is about Dunn's national profile. And I think a way I want to spin this question to you, Brian, is how his what the national perspective is on him now versus what it was when he was still alive. Because I think that, you know, when he was still alive, as you kind of talked about his Eastern tour, he was very well known when he was alive and very well regarded, and ran in circles with a lot of prominent folks. So maybe you can talk about then versus now.
Yeah, he was well known in both the Black and the white community. He was followed by all the major newspapers in the country. So he would have been better known in the past than he is presently. There hasn't been a bunch of scholarship on Dunn. At the time that I began the dissertation, there were 3 journal articles on him, one by Perkins, one by Christian, and the other by Marcus Christensen, had been at UNO. So those were the only 3 major pieces that had been written on Dunn's life, and none of them really exceeded 15 pages. So in a very short period of time, he went from being one of, and I believe at the time of his death, one of the newspapers wrote that there'll be 3 images that hang in the homes of every African American, one of Abraham Lincoln, one of Grant, and the other of Oscar James Dunn. And I mean, now he's an obscure figure that very few people know, but in his lifetime, he was famous. He was well known.
And after his death, in fact, to help raise money for his widow, Frederick Douglass came to New Orleans and gave a speech at a huge convention, and they took the money that was raised from Frederick Douglass's speech and donated it to Ellen Dunn. So yeah, it's part of the reason you made this story and made this book is just to see how much that has faded in the last 150 years. Exactly since his death, it's been 150 years. We have a question about, it would be great to know something about Dunn's time living at the corner of Canal Street and Claiborne Avenue. I will say I'm very curious about not only his time there, but what happened to his home. It's a parking lot now for tour buses. It's kind of a shame. This is an illustration in the book. It's one of the few illustrations we have of Oscar Dunn. I don't know if you all can see it. If you have a copy, it's on page 17. And this is done outside of his house after a flood in New Orleans, which we are all very familiar with. And you can see him standing on a plank with his children in the background. His wife is on the balcony back there. But Brian, can you talk a little bit about his house at Canal and Claiborne and his time there?
Actually, he had a house that was a few blocks away that was much closer to his church. And I believe that house served both as his office and his home. But once he is relegated to the post, once he's elected to this post of lieutenant governor, he realizes that he has to have a home that makes a statement about him and the African American community and him as a leader. And I think it's important that we look at the site that he chooses. Canal Street had been a dividing line for the Black and white community, the American and the Creole community. And it's not by accident, I believe, that he selects this house. It was a very nice home. It was a large home. He did have servants. He had 2 Black servants that lived there with them. And one of them is pictured. The man that is sitting in the etching is one of the servants that he has, a man that's from Arkansas. So he picks his home for this as much a statement of being in the middle of the road, so to speak, being between all of these worlds and being able to navigate all of them. And we know very little about the home except when it is mentioned in newspapers. Newspapers note that it was well appointed and that it was decorated well, that it was befitting of a man in his office.
We have a question. Yesterday, you commented briefly on the statue that was planned but never came to pass. Would you talk more about recent efforts to put this effort forward as a way of raising awareness of Dunn's life and contributions? We mentioned a little bit, I think, yesterday in the Q&A about the City Council Street Renaming Commission, which just published its recommendations to the City Council. And currently, they have recommended that Washington Artillery Park, which was named for a Confederate military unit, not President Washington, but a Confederate unit that overlooks Jackson Square, they are proposing that it be named Oscar Dunn Park. What they do with that, what the council decides is still up in the air. But Brian, I don't know if you know anything else or if you can comment about that. I mean, do you feel like that would be a fitting?
Your ear is closer to the ground on that one. I usually get my information for what's going on in regard to memorials from you or from the committees that I attend. So
are you happy about the recommendation?
I'm ecstatic. I hope it happens. I'll come down for the event most definitely, and I'll make sure that other family members are there.
Yeah. Did you include oral history from your family's stories in the book? And can you talk about how are you related to Oscar Dunn? I mean, your introduction in the book talks about the oral history that was kind of the foundation of it all, right?
Right. I'm related to Oscar Dunn through a marriage. Not through marriage, but my great grandmother, Maddie Jackson, was married to Emmanuel Dunn, who was a cousin of the Dunns.
And and the oral history element, maybe you can talk a little bit. We talked about the school already, but just the conversations you had with your great grandmother, Maddie Dunn, and maybe some of your memories of what she told you.
It's a very, these stories were given to me as a child. By the time I was in high school, she had passed. She was born in 1897, and she was from East Feliciana. And those who know Dunn, or know much about the Dunn story, after Dunn dies, his wife and her new husband, a friend of Dunn's, a man by the name of James Henry Birch, moved to East Baton Rouge, which is the neighboring parish. So she's from the parish that is right alongside East Baton Rouge. And the Dunns lived in East Baton Rouge. His family lived in East Baton Rouge. So her family comes from a planter family. Her father was the son of a slave and a planter by the name of Jackson, and the county seat is named Jackson, and it's named after a lieutenant in the Revolutionary Army, which happens to be her great great grandfather through the planter. So she comes from a very very different world from I believe Dunn, this planter elite class that she was born into. Her family had a plantation. She was pretty well heeled for an African American that was residing in her parish in that day. The Dunn family, on the other hand, sort of navigated between East Baton Rouge and the city of New Orleans. There were members of the family in East Baton Rouge and members of the family that were in New Orleans. And after being married, they decided to, like I said, he died when I was 3 years old. From my understanding, moved to the city of New Orleans, where he became a manager for a coffee company.
Brian has about 5 more minutes left, folks. So I'm going to try here. We've got one question, and then if we have time, maybe I can get to one other. But does Mitchell see a parallel between the division in the country after and during Reconstruction with what is happening today, especially given the insurrection at the Capitol? And I'll take this as an opportunity to plug. Brian was just on CNN talking about this exact question. So if you search his name or Oscar Dunn in CNN, you'll see a nice, about a 7-minute video that they did. What is it called? History Refocused, I think is the
Kate
series.
Mashuris in it, Eric Foner's in it. It was very, very nice.
An all-star lineup of historians. So Brian, can you talk about what you see if there are parallels between the two moments?
There are similarities. I hate to say that things repeat themselves exactly the same way, but there are great similarities. There's a polarization that is very, very evident today and in the United States. There's this division between race and this notion that if African Americans gain, that in some way whites will be losing out or missing something. There's also this notion of who is a citizen and who truly isn't, and who has the right to govern and who should be excluded from governance. We can also draw parallels between this notion of suffrage and blocking the rights to vote to minority communities, particularly the African American community. This isn't the first time that we see legislatures trying to strike the right to vote from African Americans. And it's important that we do look back and look at these, what came from it. What came from, a lot of people ask me, well, can we just ignore January 6th? And I think that's a very, very dangerous thing, ignoring what happened in January 6th, because that just appeases one side and it opens the potential for more violence up. And when we look at the Colfax massacre, when we look at Liberty Place, and we look at the lack of any sort of punitive measures brought against the individuals that participate in it, you have to remember that that brings on the whole Jim Crow era. That opens the door to all of these violations that will happen subsequently. So I take a very hard stance on this. I mean, I do see the parallels, and I think that there's an important message that we can learn from the narrative of Oscar James Dunn.
Well, thank you, Brian. That's a good note to end on, and it just goes to show, I think, how timely this book is. Unfortunately or fortunately, I think we have a lot we can learn from this story, from Oscar Dunn's story, from the story of Reconstruction in Louisiana. I do want to say that Brian will be here in New Orleans March 18th. I'll be with him. We're going to go to Melba's for their Eat and Read program. So you come in, buy a Po' Boy, and you get a copy of the book if you don't have one, and you can get some more Q&A in with Brian. So that'll be March 18th at Melba's over on Elysian Fields. So Brian, thank you so much. Thank you everybody here who came to the Q&A and who showed up yesterday. We had a huge crowd, I'm told, in our session yesterday, Brian. So thank you so much.
Well, I've got two things to say in closing. I'll bring a Sharpie with me. So if you have a book and you want it signed, I'll be at Melba's and I'd be happy to sign it. So if you just want to show up with your book and get it signed, I know a lot of people order books at the symposium, and typically we're there and we're able to sign them. If you're willing to come out to Melba's, I'd love to meet you and sign the book. And I want to take this last opportunity to thank Nick for being a wonderful editor, and to thank the press. This has been a wonderful experience. Thank you very much.
And there's still 15 minutes in the other two sessions. So if you want to go talk to Fatima or Clint Bruce, you still have a little bit of time to tag over to those sessions. Use the links in your emails. Thank you, Brian, and we'll talk to you later.
Take care.
All right. And somebody had a question while I'm still here about when and where is Melba's. Melba's is over on Elysian Fields Avenue. And I don't think we have a set time yet, but it'll be around lunchtime, and it's on March 18th. And so here, let me see if I can find a link for you. Yeah, so I'm going to take off here unless anybody else has a question for me, but we thank you all, and there are two other good sessions that are still going on, so thank you. All right.
Thanks everyone for joining us. I'm going to end the meeting, and we hope to see you over in our other sessions.